Welcome to the Eathen Grove, a gathering place to wander the intricacies of nature while forging connections from our minds and bodies to the ecosystems around us. I'm herbal practitioner Austin Seibouts, and I'm happy to be joining you today as we explore the Grove. Hello, I hope you're having a beautiful day today and that you're able to find some time for peace and tranquility. I'm very excited to be joining you guys on our very first podcast here with the Eathen Grove, where we'll be diving into various different subject matters ranging from natural wellness to herbs and working with the ecosystems within and around us as we work towards creating a greener world in our direct surroundings. That's actually going to be the primary subject of our very first podcast today, where we dive into increasing our own vitality by creating balanced and harmonious ecosystems within our garden spaces, our houseplants, vivariums, terrariums, and discussing the many different ways that those ecosystems interact with our own biomes in our bodies. Before we dive into that, I'd like to formally introduce myself to you. My name is Austin Seibouts, and I've been practicing herbalism for around 5 years now. I got myself involved with working with plants and people when I really found myself fascinated with the many different ways that plants can adjust our overall psyche. And it became one of my main areas of focus, working with things like anxiety, with things like stress, depression, within my own body, within my own mind. I grew up in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley in Alaska, where I was introduced to a vast array of many different flora and fauna that got me really fascinated with nature from an early age. And it wasn't until I actually moved to California, to San Francisco, that I found myself missing this connection to nature, found myself missing that natural element. And so I eventually moved to Spokane, Washington, closer to family, kind of the best of both worlds between that urban life and the more natural life that I truly was craving. And since then, I've been able to revitalize that connection to nature by working on the ecosystems here and working with people in improving overall well-being. And that actually is a great segue back into the topic at hand. I like to say that we're a reflection of the ecosystems we surround ourselves with. Not only do we shape ourselves psychologically through what we're taking in through our senses, we also are shaping ourselves physiologically through what we're breathing in, what we're getting on our skin, all the microorganisms that we're eating through our food, and what's generally around us at all times. And so the places that we're seeing and working with regularly, whether it be directly thinking about the ecosystem or not, are opportunity spaces for us to improve our own well-being while improving the well-being of other species. So the garden space particularly gives us an opportunity to really work with the soil and with the air. And when I say garden space, I'm not just referring to the outside garden, but also our own houseplants, vivariums, terrariums, that kind of good stuff. They all are an array of biomes that are self-interacting, and as humans, we have this wonderful talent on working with ecosystems where we can truly improve the life and overall harmony of that space. It just takes a little bit of intention. And when we discuss that balance, it becomes incredibly important to also talk about biodiversity on the macro scale and on the microscopic scale as well. Because as we're interacting with these ecosystems, we are also interacting with a vast array of living beings. That's not just for these particular ecosystems, but throughout our whole life in general. Soil can be particularly very biodiverse. Depending on how many nutrients are in that soil and the balance of the soil, you could be touching everything from nematodes to fungi to bacteria. And a lot of people, they get the ick when they first think about this kind of thing. But I'd like for you just to extend this belief for a moment and just recognize just how beautiful the symbiotic relationships are between our bodies and the organisms that are coming directly from the earth itself. There's a number of different connections that we have between these species and ourselves. We would be normally touching these things out in nature when we were hunter-gatherer tribes regularly. They were on the side of plants, they were in the soil while we were digging for roots, and on the animals that we were hunting too. So these are nothing new, and it's something that, unfortunately, in the modern era, we tend to kind of sanitize our minds, as I like to call it, where you're essentially trying to ignore the fact that we are made up of trillions of microorganisms that really do contribute to your overall well-being. And so we can work with the soil, we can work with our plants in this way to not only increase the biodiversity of the garden, but also increase our own biodiversity. There was actually a study that was published in the National Library of Medicine that I will link in my website, and I'll link that at the very end here, that found that gardening families tended to have a greater amount of microbiology living within their fecal matter. They had a greater digestive system function, greater diversity of their microbiology, greater fiber intake, and a greater abundance of fiber fermenting bacteria, meaning bacteria that helps to break down fiber specifically. Part of these properties are coming directly from eating foods that are coming from the garden, so you're literally eating these microorganisms, as well as many enzymes that help with breaking down food as well. But another huge part of this is just simply coming from physically interacting with the soil, physically interacting with these plants, getting it on your hands, and then it gets on, in, or around you in one way or another. Many bacteria that we can find in the plants and in the soil that get onto our bodies and within us are actually really wonderful for helping with breaking down certain nutrients in our own bodies. And then also, if we have a rich array of bacteria that are symbiotic with us, that helps to prevent infectious bacteria from taking over our gut and creating problems. This is because of the fact that they're creating a more competitive space, and there's just literally no space for those other organisms to thrive in. I think of this as a really beautiful rhyme between microorganisms and macroorganisms, where if you're talking about the garden space and you want to prevent perhaps less desirable, more weedy type of plants from coming up through your soil, if you have a rich array of ground cover, it's going to be much harder for those species to come up. There are times where those weedier plants are definitely very important for the soil and very important for the garden and yourself as well, which we'll dive into a little bit more here in a bit. But just as an example here, if you are trying to prevent quote-unquote infections of the garden or quote-unquote infections of the gut, then you're going to have a wider array of biodiversity, and that's going to make it more of a competitive space. On the other hand, those plants that are coming up in the garden that we see as weedy can also be worked with as a beneficial species to help fulfill that role of increasing the amount of competition within a garden. And in fact, many different plants that are kind of weedier make great deterrents for pests in the garden because they're distracted with another plant to eat. And we'll dive a little bit further into that once we get to a more macro scale, less microscopic. But taking it back to the microorganisms of the garden specifically, we find that they fulfill many important functions, some that are very similar to what they do in our own guts. In fact, one of the most important functions of microorganisms within an ecosystem is the breakdown of nutrients. And this is because it makes those nutrients more bioavailable for the plants that are thriving within our garden, which in turn is going to increase their nutrient output because they're getting more well-fed. And in turn, what happens is these plants produce higher quality crops for us, so they're going to be more nutrient dense, but they also increase the amount of nutrients that can return to the soil. So if you allow those plants to die back, if you create mulch or fertilizer from them, those nutrients return back to the earth itself, feeding the microbiology of the soil and creating an even stronger garden in the long term. And so when we talk about improving the microbiology of our soil, we're really also talking about improving the nutrient quality of that soil as well. So this is going to help to create a more biodiverse and more abundant soil over time. And what we can actually do here to improve this is, taking from that previous example, incorporating plant material into the garden. There's a couple different ways to do that. One that's a little bit perhaps cleaner looking, and the other one that is more of a mulch style, right? So for the cleaner method, it's called a green fertilizer. What you're essentially doing is creating a very nutrient-dense herbal tea by taking plant material from the garden, whether, again, it be from your own crops, just dead parts of the crops, or whether it be from plants that are popping up that you don't want in the garden. You take those, you put them in water for around 5 days. You can actually speed up the decay process by putting them in hot water specifically. And then after a few days, that's going to become a nutrient-dense fertilizer that you can add as a solution to your garden while you're watering it. The other method, of course, is simply chop and drop method, which is essentially taking these weeds and chopping them up into smaller parts so they can't continue growing, but still leaving them on top of the soil, so that way they decay into the soil over time. This doesn't just have to be weeds either, and it doesn't even have to be intentional. In my own backyard, I've got a black locust, so it has these seed pods that release onto the garden throughout the whole summer, and it makes a wonderful mulch for the garden. So sometimes it's easier just to let our gardens do what they do naturally. I'm sure you can already tell just by transforming the soil that you can also begin transforming yourselves, kind of evolving alongside the garden and increasing your overall biodiversity. And then beyond just microorganisms that are interacting with that ecosystem, we're also talking about microconstituents that are being released into the soil and into the air by the plants that we know and love. When it comes to the air quality, we're specifically talking here about volatile oils, the constituents that create the beautiful aromas that we know and love, that we associate with things like rose and cypress, goldenrod, ginger, all these plants that produce these essential oils. So as those essential oils are being released into the air, they're interacting with our minds and bodies in really profound ways. A lot of essential oils are highly relaxing to the nervous system, to the respiratory system, and the cardiovascular system. And then also a lot of them have antimicrobial properties that are going to help to stave off certain infections, not just of the human body, but also in the garden space. These essential oils that are released in the air can actually deter certain insects, call in certain other insects like pollinators, right? And also help to prevent fungal infections of the soil. I think of field mint as a really good example here, Mentha arvensis, which has been studied as a potential crop to have amongst corn in staving off fungal infections of the cornfield. We can also diffuse these essential oils into our home environments, which are going to replicate the aromas that we would normally be breathing in nature. They can also positively interact with our houseplants. In fact, a lot of times I will, about once every few weeks or so, spray down my plants with a little bit of some tea tree oil, diluted in water, of course, not just pure tea tree oil. And that's going to have an antibacterial property. And while I'm doing that, it's also absolutely stellar for helping to improve my own respiration. I've got asthma myself, and so anything that can help to improve the air quality around me is something that I gravitate towards. But then what if we take this to a more macro scale? What about the biodiversity of the plants that are specifically growing in our garden as well? And that's where it can become incredibly important to begin learning about the plants that grow in your local ecosystem. There's plenty of identifier apps out there such as PlantNet, and I'm not affiliated with them, but PlantNet is a wonderful app for identifying anything from weedy plants to trees to really any ecosystem, houseplants as well. And this app will give you an opportunity to see and learn about those plants where if you learn the name of it, you can start looking into, how does this impact my own body if I were to eat it? How does it impact the soil? What is the kind of function of this plant within its ecosystem? So you can learn to work with those species in your garden in a much more effective way. Learning about the plants that are growing around you in ecosystems outside of the garden gives you the opportunity to potentially propagate them. So I like to do a lot of foraging, and one of my favorite ways to forage actually isn't just for the food or for the herbs that I'm planning on taking internally, but rather for propagation. So I'll find things like wild onion, I'll find things like wild field mint, try to take cuttings and that kind of thing to propagate them back into the garden. And I'll do a whole separate segment on propagation and different techniques there in the future as well. But this is just one absolutely stellar way to begin incorporating your local ecosystems into the garden space and really helping to fight back against invasive plants in the garden space while also incorporating plants that are going to be already naturally adapted to the type of climate that you live in. So it's a great way to get to know your plants more and a great way to connect with your garden on a deeper level. And beyond that, taking it back down to the microorganism level, it's also going to diversify what type of microorganisms are in the garden. And it doesn't even have to be a complex task either. It could be that you're propagating plants from your neighborhood itself. You might know a neighbor who's planning on ripping up a tree or some other type of plant that you know is native, so you might try propagating that to your garden. You might find an herb that's growing through the cracks in the sidewalk. Obviously, you're not going to eat that herb directly from the sidewalk, but you might propagate it to your garden. And so over time, this is going to help to further increase the biodiversity of your garden, increasing the microbiology as well, and in turn, also increasing the vitality and competitive nature of that garden. Speaking of competitive environments, as our species becomes more urbanized over time, it's going to be increasingly important for us to think about our own microbiology, our own biodiversity internally, but also think about the biodiversity of the cityscapes that we live in. While there is massive industrial farming that's been happening, there's been a increasing recognition of the damage that we're doing to the planet itself. And while you might be somebody who's living in an urban setting who can't directly work with these farm settings, you can help to improve the world directly around you. And that's something that can be daunting at first. But in fact, while we're working on our own garden spaces and working on our own biology within ourselves, we are also working towards increasing the biodiversity of our local landscape as well. And in fact, there was actually a study that was published in Ecology Letters that studied 28 community gardens. Traditionally, it was believed that community gardens were actually a space where there was a lower level of biodiversity due to human activity. But what they actually found was that in these spaces, these garden spaces, there was an increase in the amount of biodiversity, increasing the amount of carbon sequestration, so basically cleaning the pollution out of the air and around the soil. And it created a space that gave opportunity for more species to find harmony and to thrive amongst us. While we don't generally think of an urban setting as being a place of growing gardens and increasing biodiversity, these are opportunity spaces to collaborate with your local other fellow humans on creating a space that's more green and that will improve everybody's overall well-being over time. It's also incredibly important for us to think about this within urban settings now, considering the fact that 54% of our human population on Earth is actually living in an urban setting, and that's expected to rise to 59% by 2030. These details are coming from an article that was titled Contribution of Home Gardens to Sustainable Development, Perspectives from a Supported Opinion Essay. And this is by, I'm probably going to butcher this, Yvonne de Klutzenaar. And she has a wonderful take where she also is mentioning that while we are having an increase in this population in urban settings, there's also a growing awareness towards the negative impacts of agricultural intensification and urbanization for human health, for biodiversity, for food quality, ecosystem resilience. So there's a really important push for us to consider how we can improve our urban settings through garden spaces, community gardens, working with our ecosystems, rather than just simply pushing that aside for more rural settings. It's incredibly important for us to start working on improving our ecosystems here, right now. Not just for ourselves, but the myriad of different species that live amongst us in these urban settings. And in fact, Rob Dunn Labs has a great quote where they say, contrary to popular depictions, cities are not monolithic deserts of concrete populated only by buildings and automobiles. Instead, they are complex mosaics of many different kinds of habitats. I love that quote because it's so true. Our urban settings oftentimes get seen as these concrete slabs, when in all reality, the numerous different spaces that we create here become habitats to thousands of different species, from the microscopic level all the way out to the macroscopic level. Rob Dunn specifically has done research on how humans impact other species around us and kind of the predictions of the future of that. One of the things that they found was they did a whole research project looking into the effects of high stress situations on ants living in New York City, on how that would affect their genetic variability. Normally within an ecosystem, when there are high amounts of stressors, whether it be from predators or whatever it might be, that generally tends to increase the amount of genetic variability within a species. What they found, however, within New York City for the ant population was that it actually decreased the amount of genetic variability in urban settings, whereas the parks that were more like a urban forest, which had more harmony, had a lot more species coming together, tended to have a greater level of genetic variability. So this means that within the garden spaces, if we're creating opportunities for species to find a place of tranquility and peace and able to live their lives, we can contribute to the well-being of another species and even have positive effects on their genetic variability. This impact that stressors in urban settings have on the ant population got me to thinking about just how much we are deeply impacted within our own lives from urbanization as well, and just how important park spaces and garden spaces can become for those living in urban settings. I'm actually going to do a whole separate podcast next week on particularly the different ways that we can work with our own well-being with herbs and practices for those of us who do live in urban settings. So keep an eye out for that one next week. I've got a space here in Spokane that's in a pretty urbanized center. I've got, a major road that's right near us, but we also have a ton of trees growing right around this apartment complex. And we've got the garden space, which has become more abundant with species as the season has gone on. And so we're helping to work towards cleaning up what we're breathing in around us. It really makes me ponder just how important it is for individuals in urban settings especially to plant things, whether they be houseplants or outside in the garden. And we as a species have this really powerful, profound effect on being able to interact with our environments in ways that change them drastically. And that could be done for good or for worse. In Rob Dunn's book, The Natural History of the Future, he also talks about what he calls islands, which are essentially these spaces, like in the example of the ants, where they're confined to particular areas of survival. And with garden spaces, with whether it be on our balconies, whether it be in the soil itself, whether it be park spaces, these are going to be island spaces for many different species to potentially thrive in. And when we begin working with the garden, we can also adjust what kind of species end up habitating that, which is going to adjust what type of plants potentially get brought in by things like birds and squirrels and other rodents. One of the first ways, of course, to do that, one of the simplest ways to do that, is to work with your pollinators. So, of course, what do pollinators love? They love to see these huge, bright flowers, right? They bring around pollinators. And the mistake that I made when I first got into working with this garden space is that while I was primarily working with these pioneer species that were more herbaceous, many of them didn't have very large flowers, so I wasn't seeing a ton of pollinators. Well, fast forward a month or two, and I incorporated a zucchini plant. Zucchini's got huge, bright orange flowers. And then we also incorporated goldenrod. And that didn't just affect the pollinators. We started seeing, of course, more pollinators come to the garden, but with them came their predators, the birds. And with those predators, they also began adjusting what kind of pests were making it into the garden, right? I think of the tomato slug, for instance, which has many bird predators, right? And while I'm not growing a tomato in the garden, that would be one of those examples where if you're bringing the pollinators around, you're also bringing their predators, which can also help to contribute in keeping your garden safe and also create more harmony over time. Another predator example here would be things like ladybugs and mantises. You can actually have those imported to your garden if that's something you're interested in. And there's many other different varieties of animals that are going to come and interact with your space. I think it's incredibly important for us to think of these animals as, again, extensions of ourselves, extensions of the garden. While we usually would chase away things like rodents, for instance, they actually can be very supportive. Rodents, of course, like to carry seeds around. They like to transport different seeds. And many times the trees that you see out in the forest, the trees that you see in parks, were actually originally planted by squirrels because they tend to take their seeds and then they can actually forget where they place those seeds, right? The same thing can happen with your garden, where over time you might have something pop up in your soil that you've never seen before, like something that you didn't plant yourself, something that wasn't previously growing there, that somehow miraculously seemed to have showed up. That could have been from birds, could have been from squirrels, could have been from any number of mammals that were seeds attached to their fur. Especially if you're living closer to a forested setting, you're going to find a lot of things making their way into the garden space. Which, speaking of forests, that leaves me with the last part of working with the animals in your ecosystem. And that is, of course, there's going to be times where there are larger mammals that create problems. I think of deer as a really good example here. And that's where your plant selection and the layout of your garden can also naturally limit their interaction as well. We can use plants like Oregon grape and Russian sage, for instance, to deter deer. They don't like the smell of Russian sage and many different types of sage, and they don't like to get prickled by the kind of leathery, pokey leaves of Oregon grape. I'm sure just with those couple examples, you can also probably think of a ton of other plants that would fit those kind of criteria. And then, of course, animals naturally fertilize things too. So when we learn to work with animals symbiotically in this kind of way, it can actually make our gardening experience way easier. It can help to self-regulate that ecosystem. And you give them a space to thrive in, you give them a space to live. And what you'll oftentimes find is, again, these animals can do things from removing pests to fertilizing to planting things. You just have to be a little bit adaptive and willing to learn how they're impacting the soil, and what they're actually planting in your soil, and how it's going to change that gardenscape over time. And then finally touching up on a few other properties that these plants can have on our garden, have on the soil itself. There's many different ways that these species can help to improve the ecosystem. Of course, we already touched on nutrients, we touched on depollution, and on pest control. But just to name a couple others, one of the great functions of the plants that come up in our garden that can be seen as more weedy or undesirable, the more annual kind of herbaceous plants, right, is that they act as distraction crops for our more desirable things like tomatoes and zucchinis and that kind of thing. So you've got all these different pests that can enter the garden, but when you have something like horseweed coming up in the garden, for instance, it might distract and dissuade them to eat those leaves rather than something else. On the other hand, there's also plants that are considered minor plants, and this is kind of touching back on nutrition of the soil. But minor plants are essentially species that have very, very long taproots that dig down deep into the earth and pull nutrients up to the surface. So things like mullein, for instance, or arrowleaf balsam root are great examples here, where they get these nutrients from deep in the earth, and when they die back in the wintertime, those nutrients are left on the surface of the soil for other plants to benefit from. There are, of course, many other ways that plants can help to improve an ecosystem that we will dive more into in our sister podcast, the Plant Profile Podcast, here on the same page that we will be posting a few days separated from our primary podcast, the Eathen Grove. I look forward to diving into many other subjects with you and exploring the many different ways that we can work with our ecosystems, with our own bodies, and with natural substances to help improve our overall lives. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach me at theearthengrove@gmail.com. And again, if you're looking for any of the links for the articles that I posted today, I will include a link in the bio, and you can go and check that out on our website. I look forward to talking to you guys in the future. Be well, take care, and have a blessed rest of your day.